School was canceled, Magnolia was canceled, and so we canceled because of the flu and all of that stuff. Did anybody show up and see the sign? Did you really? Okay. I hung a sign up on the doors out there saying that it's canceled due to flu, no church. But anyway, so that's, hey guys, that's typically if one of the schools cancels for, say, snow. Usually that's the reason they'll cancel, for weather or something like that. Church policy is we don't meet at the church if the schools are snowed out. So it's kind of the same principle. You can kind of ask the question, do we want to cancel because of sickness? And much better to be safe than sorry, I guess, in that idea. So anyway, any prayer requests? Olivia, you want to give us an update on your leg? You went yesterday, correct?
Yes.
And they did some stuff, but you don't know yet?
He just kind of like looked at it, and he said it may not be as bad.
Well, that would be good. You'll find out Friday, correct?
No.
No.
I will.
Then fill me in here. I'm struggling.
I'll go get the MRI done Saturday, and then
Okay.
I'll get results either Monday or Tuesday.
Okay, so early next week,
Yeah.
you'll have a better idea of how bad the tear is, that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am.
The people who were injured by the explosion today.
Yeah. Remember this, definitely.
Unspoken.
Unspoken. All right. Any others? Any praises? Everybody enjoy their break?
I really enjoyed
it. Look, it's the home stretch.
I love the pollen too.
For some of you guys, it's senior year, so you're just trying to survive the next 5 weeks, I think, or so. And but hang on, finish strong, but definitely finish. All right. So let's pray, and then we'll have a few songs. Gracious God, we love you. Thank you for this group. I thank you for their faithfulness to be here tonight. I thank you for who you are, what you mean to me in my life. I pray that as we sing, that we worship you well. I pray that in each of these circumstances that were mentioned, that your grace would be on the people who are hurting or sick, or God, we just pray for them. We have so many on our church prayer list. God, we just want to lift those people up to you now. We know that you are the healer, you are the comforter. God, we pray as we open up the book of Genesis, and as we continue to walk through it, that you show us something amazing from your scriptures tonight. Let us sing from hearts that are worshiping. In Jesus' name, amen.
Mystery.
instead. Just got pray for us as we go out the service, that we learn more about you. Just got pray for us and hide behind the cross as brings the word. Just got pray for all the prayer requests mentioned that we're looking up to you. Just got forgive us sins of our failure in Christ's name.
All right, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 40 and 41. Are the two chapters we're going to look at. And we're going to just kind of get a big picture view of these two stories that are similar yet different. All right? So, what are you? Don't film from behind me. Nobody needs to see that. All right. Genesis chapter 40. Joseph interprets two prisoners' dreams. Some of you may have heard this story before. We're going to kind of read through it and talk through it a little bit, try to put it into context, and try to figure out just kind of why in the world this story is in here. Because at the end of the story, it really doesn't amount to a whole lot. And so when you're preaching through Joseph, there's really big stories, long stories, and you kind of scratch your head and go, I see where this is going, but man, it's taken them a long time to get there. It almost feels like a slow developing story. But I do want you to see that there's a reason for chapter 40 and chapter 41 in this story of Joseph, and I think they are absolutely beautiful and essential to understanding Joseph's story and what God is doing in Joseph's story. All right, so the first one, and plus they're fun stories. I'll just throw that out there right off the bat. We have the cupbearer of the king, and we have the baker. All right, the cupbearer and Nathan Baker. All right, that's what we have. All right, we've got those two. And so at the very beginning of the story, it just says, and sometime after this. So he's already in prison because Potiphar's wife tricked him, and she tried to seduce him, but he would have none of it. So then she cried out, and they came and they arrested him, but they didn't kill him, which would have probably been the legitimate, that's probably what would have happened. So we see that him being in prison is really very gracious. He's experiencing the grace of God, or at least of Potiphar. And so while in this prison cell, it says sometime after this, which could be a long period of time, could be a short period of time. What we do know is that Joseph's story, from when his brothers sell him when he's a teenager, to his rise to power, to ultimately when his brothers come back and meet him, that story takes around 30 years. So this is possibly a good long time he's sitting in prison. And then he obviously, while he's in prison, becomes in good standing. Remember, everything that he touched just kind of turned to gold. I mean, he was very prosperous. So even after he goes to prison, now they start to give him some responsibilities. And he meets these two guys right here at the beginning of chapter 40. And let's read a little bit about their story. It says, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. Now, at the very beginning, it tells us one thing. They were thrown into prison because they committed an offense. It doesn't say what the offense was. It doesn't even really acknowledge whether or not they were guilty of the offense. It just says they were thrown into prison because the king had something against them. Now, when we read that in our language, it says that they committed an offense. We would think immediately they're guilty. That's really not how the judicial system worked under a king. It wasn't innocent until proven guilty. It was whatever the king says goes. And so these guys were thrown into prison. And there's a lot of guesses as to why they were thrown into prison. You've got the cupbearer, which was the one who would be drinking or eating right before from the king's plate to make sure that nothing was poisoned. Now, how awesome of a job would that be? What's your job? Your job is to die so that I won't have to. That was the cupbearer's job. It was a lofty position. It was someone who was the most trusted of the king, probably someone very, very wealthy. So whatever this offense was, it was pretty serious. A lot of people have said, well, obviously, maybe there was an attempt to try to kill the king. Somebody poisoned the food, and the cupbearer didn't catch it. Maybe the king got sick. You know, all of these different things. There's so many things, but the Bible doesn't tell us. All we do is we're introduced into the story, and we've got the baker, and we've got the cupbearer, and they've been thrown into prison. And in verse 2 it says, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. Now remember, when the Bible slows down and speeds up, it's doing that to draw your attention. Okay? And so here we have, and some time passes. So there's this time, but then it kind of zooms in on this story and introduces the characters and says, hey, there was some time that these guys were in prison together with Joseph. Then we get to kind of the meat of the story. It says, and one night they both dreamed. The cupbearer, the baker, the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with them in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? They said to him, we have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, well, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So he stops for a moment. Now remember, he has a history with dreams, doesn't he? Remember in the very beginning of the story, he has these dreams, and he goes and tells his brothers and his parents, hey, you guys are all going to worship me because I had these dreams. And that doesn't go so well for him, does it? You'd think that maybe at this point in the story, he'd just kind of leave dreams alone. But I think this is interesting. He hears about this problem that they have. They're obviously pretty stressed about it. And he says, well, I can't interpret your dreams, but don't interpretations belong to God? I mean, isn't God the source of all wisdom? And he basically says, hey, why don't you tell them to me, because I know God. So since me and God are in good standing, you tell me your dreams, and we'll see what God says about them. So here's how he opens the conversation. God can interpret those dreams. Tell him to. Tell him to me. I'll share with you insight from the Lord about those dreams. So the first thing that we see with him is that though he's been in jail for some time, falsely accused, he's still doing what? He's still focused on the Lord. He's still speaking for God. He's still acting in a morally right way. Big contrast to Judah, his brother, and the rest of his brothers that sold him into slavery. We see that Joseph is living in step with the Lord. So he says, you tell me your dreams, and I'll interpret them for you in the power of the Spirit of God. All right, so they do. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into this pit. So he gives his interpretation. He says, okay, I'll interpret your dream. In 3 days, you're going to be put back into your position. Basically saying you'll be found innocent. You'll be put back as the lofty cupbearer of the king. And when you get there, hey, don't forget me. Mention to Pharaoh that I'm here, and I'm not I haven't done what they've accused of me. I was stolen from my land, and now I'm here falsely. So when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, He said, I think I would like to get in on some of this. He said to Joseph, I also had a dream where there were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. Not such a good interpretation, right? I think it's interesting. This one doesn't follow with the same request. He doesn't say to the baker, hey, would you put in a good word for me? Because he's just basically told the baker, well, in 3 days, here's what's going to happen. He's going to kill you. That's what's going to happen. So what happens? So what happens? It says on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. So everything works out exactly as Joseph said. The cupbearer is put back in his lofty position. Joseph has been so obedient to God, even in this long time in prison, that he was there for really no reason of his own, falsely accused. And then we have maybe some of the saddest verses right after that. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. What a jerk. Joseph gives him this favorable interpretation, and he goes back into his service in this lofty position in the kingdom and completely forgets about him. Well, the next chapter starts off like this. After 2 whole years. So now we have Joseph still in prison for 2 years. Innocent. He was faithful, wasn't he? Why wouldn't God set him free? Why wouldn't God intervene in this story and have the chief cupbearer go to Pharaoh and be like, listen, I'm going to tell you, I met this guy who shared with me this interpretation, and he says that he's innocent. We should at least go look at this. But he completely forgets about it. And Joseph just sits rotting in this cell for 2 whole years. Remember when I talked about pace of the scripture? It's amazing how it zooms in on this one night, these 3 days, and then just in a tiny little sentence, and 2 years go by. We kind of forget about God's timing when we look at things like this. Not always does God's timing play out in our design or plans. We're the generations of immediate gratification. We're the microwave generation, right? We're not the crock pot generation. That's grandma. Right? Crock pot generation, they put stuff on in the morning, it's not ready until that night. Microwave generation, look, I cooked my dinner in 2.5 minutes. And that's us, right? That's us. And so when we look at this story and we see God's pace, that's something to remember. We're going to see God ultimately move Joseph to where he needs to be and where God wants him to be, but it doesn't happen in Joseph's timing. Joseph is still sitting completely innocent in jail for who knows how many years he has now been there. And here's what it says. It says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump. They fed in the reed grass, and behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after they sprouted, 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And this wrecked his world. Obviously, it was a very intense dream. And he wanted to know what this mix. Now, that would be a fairly intense dream. I don't remember a lot of my dreams. I don't know much. I can't remember it, but this seems like it would be something that is fairly terrifying. You've got 7 cows, and you have 7 other, carnivorous cows that come in and eat the other cows and don't get any fatter. So you got thin cows, you need fat cows, and that might mess your evening up. All right. So that's kind of where we are in this story. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Pharaoh told him his dream, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. This story reminds me a lot of the story of Daniel. When you look at the beginning of Daniel, read those first 7 chapters, there's a lot of really cool stories of men of God interpreting dreams. When Daniel interprets dreams, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God scrambled the brain of Nebuchadnezzar. I love those stories. But this is one of those stories where this king begins to pull in all of these wise men, and he's got nothing. They have no idea what this dream means. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, 2 years later, I remember my offenses today. Oh yeah, I was supposed to tell you about Joseph. 2 years later, he finally remembers when circumstance arises, and now he goes, hey, I know a guy. I know a guy that interpreted my dream. Verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants, he put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I having dreamed his own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So he goes and he tells Pharaoh, Joseph, he actually predicted what happened to us on your birthday 2 years ago. He said that's what was going to happen. And it happened. So Pharaoh called for Joseph, brought him in out of the pit. They cleaned him up. Verse 14 it says, when he had shaved himself, changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh shares with him the dreams. I won't read all of that again, but we skip down. And here's how it said. At the very beginning, Joseph, in verse 16, Pharaoh asked him, hey, can you interpret dreams? And he says, it's not me. I can't. I really cannot interpret dreams. But God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Or when we say favorable, that actually means accurate. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that he knew it was going to be a good answer. He just knows that God's the one that can give you the right answer. All right? So immediately, 2 years later, after he gave God credit the first time, and then the baker and the cupbearer, they just left him there to rot for another 2 years, we see that he still hasn't lost faith in God, has he? Knowing that this may very well in the exact same way, where he shares the message and then gets thrown back into prison. Why would he think any different? That's what happened the first time. But he says, God will give you a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh goes into the whole story. In verse 25, Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh that what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blinded by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Then he tells him, there will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, there will arise 7 years of famine. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. So here's what he says. He says, here's what your dream means. God is going to bless you for 7 years. But immediately afterwards, he is going to send 7 years that are going to decimate the land. They're going to make the good years just desolate. That's how intense this is going to be. And so Pharaoh, he listens and he sees this. He gets some guidance from Joseph. Joseph says, you need to appoint someone to begin storing food right now. Find the wisest person that you have. You put them in charge. You have them store up food so that during the 7 years you will have food to eat. Out and completely left him to rot in jail. But even though no one noticed, no one acknowledged what he was doing for God for so many years of his life, he remained faithful. And then finally, God has placed him in this place where he stands before the king, and the king sees something different about him. And what is it that he saw? Did he say, man, this Joseph, that's a good looking dude? No. What he noticed was that he has wisdom, but it's not the wisdom of man. This is the Spirit of God in him. What a great testimony for you and for me. That there is. Now, I have heard people preach this message this way. If you'll just be faithful to God, He'll give you all of your earthly desires. That's just not at all what this passage is about. Do you know how I know that? Because these weren't his desires. When we get later on into this story, Joseph, even though he has possessions, even though he has power, even though he's no longer a slave, he's no longer in prison, even though now he's kind of the boss of the guy that threw him into prison and held him in prison, even though all of that stuff takes place, we see at the end of his life, he says, please take me away from this place and bury me in the land of my fathers. Before he's about to die, he finds, and he says, this was never my plan. This was always God's plan. You see that Joseph is not receiving all of the desires of this life. No, Joseph is being brought and placed into a place where he can serve God to the fullest. And we see that. We see that he finds comfort in seeing God's plan in his life. We get to verse 50 down there in this chapter. It says, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar's priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful, listen to this, in the land of my affliction. Now that word is interesting. It's a Hebrew word, and this is not his home. Even though he's escaped the prison, even though he's been put second in command, this is not where his heart is. His heart is in another land. His heart is in the land that was promised to him. Now the imagery here, I think, is absolutely beautiful. Though he's blessed with a different land. God bless us with temporary things in this life. We have to understand that our ultimate treasure will never be in this land. God may never give you a kingdom. Matter of fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say he probably won't. I don't see a lot of kings and queens in this room. Maybe. Good luck to you. But if he does, the desires that you have, what will? Well, it'll be heaven. It'll be the land that God has promised. It'll be the kingdom you can possibly imagine because Christ will be there. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph has said. There was a famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So his prophecy, his interpretation of these dreams is a right and good one. I would imagine that would have been a stressful first 7 years. Going, man, I really hope I was right about this. I really hope we're storing all of this up for a reason. But then when the famine comes, oh man, when you look at how he deals with all of this, he basically builds a kingdom with wheat. I mean, people are selling everything that they have to come and to buy bread because there's nothing anywhere. And so Joseph is there saying, sure, just bring me some cows and I'll give you bread. And then a week later, yeah, just bring me some more cows. And his empire in Egypt just flourishes under his rule and his reign. So when the famine spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the of God. We see the beauty of everything he's putting into place. He uses Joseph's faithfulness to ultimately lift Joseph up to a place where, well, in the next few chapters, he's going to have a lot of impact on the world, on the nations, but he's going to have a lot of impact on God's promise to his brothers, and God's promise to his dad, and God's promise to you and to me, to bring Jesus through his people. Joseph's going to play an instrumental part in this story, even in the land of his affliction. So that begs this question, and this is what I think we take from this. How do we stay faithful, knowing for a fact that in this life we will face affliction? This life will never be our home. As Christians, we're just traveling through. Anybody ever been on vacation, and by the end of vacation, you're like, I just want to go home? I pretty much feel that every time I go. This last week, we were away from our girls. I wanted to be with my girls. By the end of the week, I wanted to be home with my girls. I enjoyed myself. I had a good time, but it wasn't home. I was just passing through. That's this life for us. There may be temporary joys, there may be happiness, there may be some great experiences, but ultimately our home is somewhere else. So knowing that in this life we will never truly be fulfilled like we will in heaven one day, how do we stay faithful as Joseph was faithful? I think the answer comes in this story as we keep going. We see God's plan unfold before our very eyes, but in our God, in the same way that Joseph. Question one: do you have God's Spirit living inside of you? Are you a child of God? That's the first question, because this really doesn't mean a whole lot to you if not. Ultimately, this story is going to lead to the cross, and it's going to lead to Jesus. That's where it's pointing us to. And so that's the first question you have to answer. Do I have a relationship with Christ? Because if I fill up with any, I think it's amazing in this story that Joseph, this prisoner, this Hebrew, he would have been looked at. I think those two questions are the most important questions we can take from this. One, do I know Christ? Am I like Joseph in that I have the Spirit of God living inside? Focus on the Spirit of God living in Joseph. And we would see that gospel presence in Joseph's life and ask the question, what are we doing with the gospel presence in our life? Or do we have an understanding, an appreciation, a love for the gospel? It's 814 years.
I'm comfortable.